Again, for the agenda, we're going to cover incident management, a little bit of troubleshooting, um, and then I believe that those two topics generally go a little fast, but we'll see. Then should leave plenty of time at the end for open Q&A, as well as any questions to cover any of the preceding material and any concerns that might be there. So with incident management, this is a big thing for SREs. Again, yearning back to the beginning where I talked about SREs shouldn't ideally be just the DevOps firefighting team, but they should be a team that promotes reliability and availability and good practices throughout an organization. So, for example, incident management be something that if an SRE org gets added to a company, one of the things they might do is ensure that the processes that are in place for managing incidents is productive, useful, and works towards reducing the impact of incidents and reducing repeated instances of the same incident. So incidents being defined as, I would say, generally a situation where I'd probably say where the SLA is going to be breached, has been breached, or a breach is imminent. Because sometimes if you're on call for a service, maybe there's a minor issue, you manage to fix it and don't really need to create a report per se for that specific incident. But when things get big and you need to call in basically a strike team, or not really a whole team, but just escalate that issue to raise awareness, and then later discuss it in postmortem. So, and I'm sure that some of you have probably experienced incidents before. So I would actually ask for a show of hands. Go ahead and raise your hand if you have, in fact, been woken up at the early hours of the morning for an incident that was breaking the site or the service. Just go ahead and raise your hands if you've had to wake up at like 2 a.m. or something like that, if that's something you've had to deal with before. So I've seen a lot of hands, so it seems like we're all familiar with this, so I won't, probably won't need to. Some of this might just be review for some of you, but and that's okay. You can go ahead and put your hands down now. But yeah, so it seems like most of us then know that feeling of the phone going off or the pager going off and getting out of bed and stumbling towards the computer to figure out what's on fire. So on call, though, being on call, what does a healthy on call look like? This is very important and something that I specifically worked with at Facebook. So you do, while on call, ideally want to be able to spend most of your time doing the engineering work as if you weren't on call. Ideally, on call should be a thing that you occasionally have to take time to ensure things are okay, but you still have time to get the work done. Because if you're spending all of your time on call, especially if it's off work hours, then there's a strong chance that that on call is too heavy, that there needs to be some reliability work done to prevent fires. Minimizing pages, also good, but of course having 0 incidents is a non-goal, because if stuff isn't breaking, then you're probably not, I won't say not taking enough risks. Like, taking risks isn't a virtue, but you know, a lot of companies still want to move fast. And using Facebook as an example, like if Facebook had 0 incidents, large or small, then that probably mean that it's not really doing a lot of exciting stuff. And that was kind of the mentality there. And so minimizing incidents, if you try to say, okay, we want 0 incidents, just depending on the services you own or the company or whatever, maybe that's a non-goal, because maybe that just discourages anybody from like taking risks or, you know, pushing the envelope or anything like that. So one thing to keep in mind, obviously there are services where 0 incidents is definitely a plus. Like, for example, observability. Having an incident in observability and being risky and fearless in observability, everybody will depend on their observability. So if the metric services or log services go down, then it's going to be very hard to debug anything else if it goes down. So effective dashboards, effective alerts, don't want to be woken up, have some obscure alert, and have no idea what to do with it. The on-call report. I generally find it's good to have a sort of weekly report or handoff with the on-call. That way, issues can be identified and followed up on as well. So if there are recurring issues, we want to make sure, okay, this has been happening a lot, and we can see evidence that it happens every week or so. That way, you can assign a follow-up to say, oh, let's get this fixed, and then that person can claim impact in their performance review and say, like, okay, so we were getting this problem every week, and it would take about an hour or two of the on-call's time. I fixed it, so it no longer happens, and so then you can visibly claim that impact. That's why on-call reports and taking notes and doing handoffs can be helpful to eliminate recurring issues. Incident response stages and the mean time to etc. So when you have a full-blown incident, there's generally and this is an easy to derive list. You don't have to memorize this or take notes or whatever. This isn't like a gold standard list, but if we just think about what happens in an incident, well, something breaks. There's a gap between it breaking, and turn on my camera again. My camera breaks, and then I detect that my camera breaks, and then I acknowledge that my camera turned off, and then I declare that my camera has turned off, and then I mitigate that, and then I call it fully resolved. But for incidents, yes, it follows this pattern. The reason why you can identify these different stages, and the reason why these stages are identifiable as such, the gaps in between them can be measured and measured in aggregate, because there is a difference between, for example, when the system breaks and when you actually got an alert and when the person who got the alert got out of bed and did something about it. So that's what the MTT and then arbitrary letter, that's where these come into play. So mean time to detect, identify, recover. When you have a lot of incidents that you can aggregate from, you can start to take a look at how long is it taking us to detect that something is wrong. Where's the gap between the problem occurring and some alarm firing? Where's the gap between identifying what the issue is, recovering from the issue, acknowledging the alert, so on and so forth. There's different ways to split it. I wouldn't say you have to memorize all of these. Again, there's tons of these, and depending on where you work or what the company decides to do, they might measure some but not care about others, and they might not even necessarily use these acronyms. They might have their own system in place, but these are there just for you to know that, like, these are metrics that can be specifically used, things that we care about measuring, like how our performance on incidents response. And then MDT and MTBF, let's see, mean time between failures, that's MTBF, mean time between failures. So how long do you go between incidents? Like, it has been 20 days since the last whatever. And then MDT, mean downtime, I think, like how much downtime there is during each incident. Again, you don't necessarily have to memorize these, but it's just there to keep in mind that these exist, and these are the kinds of things that as an SRE you might want to take a bird's eye view of and start to measure and see, like, hey, we're really struggling with our mean downtime in each incident. Like, we spend a lot of downtime every time there's an incident, and there's a large number of incidents, or else hey, it's taking us a long time to detect these incidents. We need to work on our alerting, stuff like that. With that happening, there are some roles that you can derive from the response process. And again, with these roles, as with everything else, each company will do it differently, and these roles are not necessarily set in stone. But these roles are useful, even though perhaps one person does more than one role, or they intersect in various ways. In one form or another, these roles can and should be filled by most places. Even if you don't have a specific person assigned to each role specifically, you'll see them usually played out in a lot of places. So to go over them, the incident command, you need somebody who's basically just in charge of delegating and having a high level understanding and knowing what should be prioritized in solving the incident, saying like, okay, so here's what's wrong. Here's who I have working on fixing it. And here's what needs to be done first. And this is in the way though. So I'm going to talk to this and that person from that team to remove that roadblock. So pretty self-explanatory, I would say though. Operations, this role is important, again, even if there's not like a person assigned as operations, but it's good to ensure that there is not too many cooks in the kitchen. You need somebody who's exclusively applying different tools and things, modifying the state of the service. Because if Bob over here says, oh, that's broken, let me try this, and Jim over here says, oh, let me try this, and they don't talk to each other, then it could start doing anything, and neither Bob nor Jim will understand what it's doing because they don't realize that they're both trying to modify state. So there needs to be exclusive control in the hands of the ops leader who's actively managing the technical aspect. Let's see. So feedback polls have just appeared. We still have obviously time to go, but I want to make sure everybody has a chance to fill those out. So be sure and take that opportunity when you can. I can give everyone a second now if they choose. If you haven't had a chance yet, there'll still be time at the end, whatever, so you can take that time whenever you need. So I'll go ahead and move on though. So for communication, over communicating is usually never a bad thing when it comes to incidents. And so that role, even if you have one person doing multiple roles, there should be a lot of communication happening, regular updates. Stakeholders really want to know. Everybody wants to know. Your downstream customers, they want to know, okay, what's happening? When is it going to be back up? What's being worked on? So you have to ensure that there is a way that, because even if you're unsure, that just telling them something, giving them some kind of status update reassures them that it is being looked at. And this is important because otherwise the customers, stakeholders can get a little anxious, and well, you want to maximize that communication. You'll notice that with the ops lead, it's the similar communication to like, no, we're working on it, so don't worry about it, so that you don't have too many cooks in the kitchen. So last one, planning. This one might not be intuitive at first, but really the planning role is important because sometimes when you're modifying the state of the service to mitigate an incident, you do things that need to be undone later. This is because there's a difference between mitigating and fully closing and resolving an incident. Mitigate it, you want to do that first. You don't want to immediately rush to like, okay, what was the root cause? What's happening under the hood? It's better to focus on like, okay, what is the problematic metric? What metric needs to be brought back to stable levels? And then everything else we can figure out later. We can figure out exactly why. We can figure out exactly which line of code later. But for now, let's just try to bring things back to normal and mitigate the impact. Now, sometimes knowing the line of code that's a problem or the configuration or whatever, sometimes that can be the best solution, but not always. So planning could be like, okay, well, we released a new version and everything started breaking. And so to mitigate, let's quickly roll back. But the planner will write down, okay, we rolled back to an older version. We need to redeploy at some point, or we change these config values to get the traffic unblocked, but we need to change those back once we fix the underlying issue. Stuff like that. Planner needs to keep track of this stuff. At Facebook, it was things like, okay, so sometimes the service is behaving, or like there's a bunch of traffic that was dropped and we need to reload, we need to rescrape a bunch of data into the warehouse. And so you just add like, let's just add thousands of machines to the service, process all of that, And then once we're done with that, we need to give those machines back, because Facebook will have, like, extra machines in a pool that it can lend out to different teams and services. And then obviously it's going to want those machines back when you're done. Otherwise, you're developing a relationship of mistrust where they lend you machines to mitigate an incident, you never give them back. Well, when the capacity planning season comes around, they might be like, oh, well, you never give back anything we give to you, so we're going to be stingier about allocating capacity to you. So these kinds of FANG company, huge organization things, if you're working with capacity, planning is important to keep track of where is that going, where are our resources being modified for this incident, and how do we put everything back to the way it was once it's over. But yeah, that's just a little bit of background from my experience there. So without structure, if you don't have these roles, if they're not being filled in some way or another, even if it's just a somewhat minor incident with only 2 people, and one of them is like incident commander and communicator, and the other one is the operations leader and the planner, that'll work. And you could also maybe for your company define additional roles, but they just essentially, these roles need to be done, kind of like the 4 golden signals in some way need to be covered for your service, because otherwise you'll just have people stepping on each other, too many cooks in the kitchen. Freelancing, technical navel gazing. Technical navel gazing, just the term I call for when you spend too much time like, oh, I wonder what the root cause is, I wonder if the kernel is caching memory in a certain way that makes it such that, oh, let me experiment with that locally to see. Like, no. Like, we're losing money, we're losing customers. You need to forget about what the root cause is and fix the, fix the problem, mitigate the problem, fix the root cause later. Structure is kind of hopefully meant like, even if you're tempted to get too technical, maybe the incident commander will be like, okay, what's happening and what do we need to do, and kind of help bring you back on track. So yeah, incident report, root cause analysis, presenting and postmortems. So apologize if the text is a little bit small here, but you don't really need to, oops, that is not what I wanted to do. You don't need to memorize any of this or whatever. You don't really need to read all of it. It's just here to indicate that there is, this is the kind of information you might have in an incident report. You might be a little more verbose, but at Facebook, for example, there was a whole internal tool and template that you would fill out for details about the incident. And so you'll be descriptive in how you name it, and in the summary, you'll have, like its current status, and then you have like started, detected, created, mitigated, possibly additional fields. This goes back to those mean time to detect, mean time to investigate, so on and so forth. All those things, including those in the report, be important so that those metrics can be extracted later. If we just take a look at the difference between when it was detected, when it was declared, then we have their time to declare. I don't know. I'm not sure. And again, those names are not set in stone, but just conceptually, you get the idea. Having this information so that in aggregate, these can be reviewed later. And it could be a bit of an SRE role to look at these SEV reports in aggregate and say, okay, where are we struggling with incidents the most? Sometimes, and at Facebook especially, there were prompts to ask you like, okay, could we have done anything better? Okay, so how was it detected, and could we have detected it sooner? Escalation, like when did we, who did we talk to once the issue was declared? And should we have escalated sooner? Is there someone else we should have brought into the call? Remediation, prevention, same questions, like, is there anything that we could do to make sure this doesn't happen again in the future? And that's a big one, obviously, because that's part of the preventing fires. Then root cause analysis could be included in the report as well. But I'm sure some of you are probably familiar with incident reports that could be just review. So yeah, there's, I would say that this could be a behavioral type of question potentially. Like I haven't been asked this, but I almost feel like I could see this being asked at like a Google interview or something in a sort of behavioral aspect where it's like, you know, how do you approach the root cause of a problem? Um, in the sense, it would be like, well, okay, Bob committed some code and it broke the service. And if that's only as deep as you go, then, well, okay, have you thought about continuous integration? Why didn't that catch it? What about continuous deployment? Why didn't that prevent it from impacting everything? Like the prevention here would be like, okay, we're not going to assume bad intent on Bob's part. We're going to assume that Bob probably thought that it was going to work or it was working locally. Like, did he run tests? Well, I don't know, but tests should be set up as part of your continuous integration. Did those tests pass? If you don't have tests there, why not? If they didn't pass and it was still landed, then why not? Was he aware that the tests didn't pass? Is that blocking? Do your tests block landing like that? That should be in place. Continuous deployment as well. Okay, so if the code is problematic, did you have integration tests to catch if it might break the behavior of the service? Did you have alarms set on your test or Q&A staging tier? Did you set alarms there? Did you observe any issues there? Like, there's so many things that could prevent Bob from committing bad code and having that be released to the whole world. So many stages there. And if you're thinking about that systematic prevention, then you're thinking about it correctly. But if you're just kind of pointing fingers and playing the blame game, well, that's not a behavior that they're really looking for. You know, like nobody really wants you to go into a postmortem and say like, oh, well, it was their fault or this fault or whatever. It's more of just like, well, nobody wanted anything to break, but it broke because potentially our processes could be designed better to prevent it. And so that's the kind of prevention that you want to be targeted for. Like, why, how is it that we built a system where Bob could easily make a simple, honest mistake and it would take down the whole system? Like, that should not happen, regardless of, whether or not Bob should have known. Like, maybe he shouldn't have known, maybe adding an extra comma in the config, if that takes down your entire service, then you have bigger problems. So yes, that root cause analysis, those are things to consider there. But yeah, in presenting it, yeah, this can be, I'd like another raise of hands. How many of you have had to be in like a post-mortem meeting where you've had to be the presenter for an issue that occurred for a service that you own or support? So raise of hands if you've had to present in a post-mortem meeting before. See 3 hands, 4 hands. So a decent chunk of people, not everyone. So, all right, go ahead and put hands down. And unless, of course, you have a question, and just a reminder that I am checking for those. So, but yeah, presenting. So it seems about half of us had, half of us have not. The ideal here, especially working at a FANG company or something, is you want to have a blame-free culture. You want to really promote the idea that you're not under attack. And you might feel a little bit defensive because you'll have to be prepared for like, okay, our service broke, here's what happened. And people will say, so why is it set up like this? Or could we do it like that? You might feel defensive, but you have to understand that the idea here is we want to build our systems to be resilient to failure. And it's not personal. It's just an opportunity to perhaps learn, or else inform people there kind of what the shortcomings of a system are. And so hopefully you'll learn to get a better idea of what the shortcomings are and also what the decisions behind those trade-offs are. So instead of going into the meeting and somebody says, why didn't you design it like this? And hopefully they shouldn't say, why didn't you, but more like, why isn't it designed like this? And you can say, well, we considered that early on, but because of this trade-off, we decided it was worth the risk to do that. And if they say, are you sure it's worth the risk? And you say, yes, well, because this or that, the more you understand about your SLA, your SLO, and the trade-offs that your service is making, the more you can inform in that meeting, and also understand what good follow-ups would be to an incident. Because another anti-pattern that I've seen is you go in, you present, and then somebody says, well, you should probably be doing this with the service. And they're like, okay, we'll add that as a follow-up. And then everybody in the room might suggest a follow-up, and you kind of just go ahead and, okay, sure, yeah, we'll do that. But you're not actually committed to do those follow-ups because you kind of intuitively know that that's not going to be prioritized, or that doesn't actually fix the problem. You just kind of say yes because you feel pressured to in the meeting. And so those follow-ups end up sitting around forever until they're eventually deleted or swept under the rug. Ideally, you should come into the meeting knowing, okay, this is what needs to happen in the future. These are the follow-ups that we should do, because you know best, and you know whether or not you're going to be able to commit to those. So ideally, you would then say, like, somebody says, can you do this as a follow-up? And you say, so that won't actually solve the problem because this or that or why. So instead, what we're going to do is this, and that will ensure blah, blah, blah. And hopefully you'll have that as more of a buffer against feeling like, okay, you're getting these follow-ups piled on you, but then you are just going to ignore them. So yeah, that's an anti-pattern you want to avoid. Let's see. Good follow-up design and testing for failure. And the reason why I'll hit hard on follow-ups, I was part of a strike team at Facebook to, there was a huge backlog of critical, quote unquote, I'm using air quotes a lot, I noticed. I've just become very self-conscious that I've been doing this, like, take a drink every time I use air quotes. But yeah, critical, so-called critical alerts were, there's a huge backlog of these critical follow-up tasks in the data infra organization. And so me and a strike team, I was assigned to a strike team to kind of help take down this backlog and be like, okay, if we have so many critical tasks that haven't been done, maybe they're not really critical. Like maybe we should be a little honest about the criticality of a task that has been sitting in a pile for a year untouched. And so we talked to service owners, and we just kind of implemented some standards for, like, what does it mean if it's critical, and encouraged people to say, okay, if it's critical, then mean it. If it's not, then just say it isn't, and just be honest about that. And there should be an atmosphere of, like, being honest about, like, no, we're not really going to complete that in it as if it were critical. Otherwise, communication breaks down if we're all just putting on a front. So that's why I beat the hammer on good follow-up design and stuff, is because I dislike that sort of posturing culture that could occur if we're not deliberate about holding people blame-free for prioritizing things deliberately, whether it's prioritizing it low or prioritizing it high. So with a good follow-up design, some of these critical tasks that were in the backlog that hadn't been touched for months or a year, they'd have things like a very bad title, very vague title, and minimal description. And ideally, the title or the metadata on the task should indicate some kind of priority. Be relatively descriptive. In the description of the task, include links, include numbers of incidents and IDs of diffs, just as much information as you can, so that if somebody did come back to this months from now, and if they're new to the team, they could piece together what it's talking about. So this is just, and you have to have a good scope defined, like a critical task that's going to take a couple of months. I mean, is that realistic? Like, you'd have to rearrange your entire roadmap in order to accommodate that task. Maybe you can split it up into smaller chunks where critical action item for a week, and then the rest is just sort of a higher priority or a lower priority, something that can be deprioritized until roadmap planning for next half. And the timeline, it's good to be honest about the timeline too. Like, okay, if this is critical, is it going to be fixed in a reasonable amount of time? If you can own these follow-ups, and if they're not pushed on you, then you can be honest about the priority. I already discussed this, but this was just placeholder slide for me to get a little bit into my experience with that critical task strike team.
Want to become a software engineer at Google? You can, like thousands of our students. You just need to learn from those who've already cleared FANG interviews. At Interview Kickstart, our interview prep courses are developed and taught live by 150 plus instructors from Tier 1 companies like Google and Facebook. Our courses are tailored to help you crack software engineering domain interviews, including back-end, full stack, machine learning, embedded systems, data science, and more. To learn more, book your free webinar slot today